Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start now. I'm really thrilled to be chairing this afternoon's event, a book launch for Matthew Teller's book. And here it is, 9 Quarters of Jerusalem, that Caabu is jointly hosting with the MBI Foundation. And it really is a wonderful book. I've actually had the chance to read it. And for those who visited Jerusalem, as I've been fortunate to have done on many occasions over the last 30 years, it really does paint a wonderful, glorious human picture of life inside this old city that means so much to so many people across the world. People have sort of various ideas, conceptions about Jerusalem that Matthew takes us through, but he gives us, I think, he looks underneath the hood of this wonderful space. And you can get the book. We have it on our online bookshop. I really do recommend it. And I also, it's going to be useful to me because often I land up on our parliamentary delegations and we have half a morning to walk around with a bunch of MPs or lords, the old city. And I now have a whole new host of new anecdotes and tidbits to entertain them with. So do go and get it, buy it for your friends, and you won't be disappointed. Now, you've seen the biography. So Matthew is a journalist. He writes for all sorts of outlets, including the BBC, Guardian, and he's produced documentaries for the BBC, Radio 4, World Service. So he's also done a lot of travel writing, travel guides, and certainly that expertise comes through in the book. So we're going to hear from him first, and he has some slides that he's going to show us, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience participants, in a Q&A. If whilst he's speaking, I'll be very grateful if you could keep on mute so we don't get any interference. It is being recorded, so you'll be able to share the recording when it comes out later on. And just before I hand over to Matthew, it's just to say that, of course, Caabu is jointly hosting it with MBI, but for those who aren't members, please do consider joining Caabu. We very much like to welcome you to the council. Please join up, get your friends to join up. We have plenty of exciting events coming, including our next one on the 26th of April with Mark Owen Jones, who is bringing out a book on digital authoritarianism in the Middle East. So that promises also to be very exciting. So, Matthew, 9 quarters. Now, I assume you're going to explain to us, I'm sure, this and the many other mysteries of this place. 9 quarters, that sounds a little bit like my maths, to be quite honest, but I know that you're going to be able to explain why the title, and to take us through this wonderful city in all its different facets. Thank you so much for writing the book and being with us today.
Thank you so much, Chris, as well. Yeah, I mean, I hope we will get to the bottom of the quarters issue. Let me just share my screen so you can see that. Hopefully you can see that. That's a panel just with the book cover and some thanks, which I'll get to first, if that's all right, before they get lost in the shuffle. So thank you to Chris and obviously to Joseph and all the colleagues at Caabu as well. Thank you to Carolyn Perry and Marylyn and colleagues at the MBI, Al Jabba Foundation. Both organizations are hosting today. And since this is a book launch as well, and a ton of people who helped me make this book happen too. So thank you to Mark Ellingham, my editor at Profile Books, to Andrew Franklin as well, to the publisher, and friends in Jerusalem, Raed Saadeh, Khalil Al-Asali, George Hintelian, also Dan Adamson, Maram Sumrain was very helpful in Jerusalem as well. There's a load of people. I won't go through every single person, but there's always, in these projects, there's a lot of thanks that need to be said. The first thing that I want to get to, first of all, and most important of all, is that Jerusalem is not my city, and it never will be my city. I'm very, very aware coming to this project and having written what I've written. I'm very aware of a 150 years or maybe even more, maybe 200 years of people like me behind me having done the same. People, white people, English, well-spoken, well-educated, relatively posh English men in particular, who have claimed Jerusalem, or sometimes claimed all of Palestine for themselves, for Britain, for Christianity, and then sort of proceed to tell everybody at length their opinion and why that matters so very, very, very much. That's not why I've done what I've done, and I hope if you get a chance to buy the book and read it that you'll see that that's not what I've done as well. I wrote this book because I could see an imbalance in the narratives about Jerusalem in my culture, in English-speaking culture in the West. Palestinian lives and Palestinian voices have been excluded too much and too often. I'm lucky to have some small platform from which I can speak, and I wanted to use that platform to try and help redress that balance. Balance is a tricky word. We hear it a lot in relation, particularly to news media, and it gives an image of a seesaw. It implies there are two sides, and in this context, invariably, you're talking about an Israeli side, which is very often conflated with Jewish, and you're talking about a Palestinian side. And that seesaw idea also implies a fulcrum, a dispassionate fulcrum in the middle that's doing the balance. And the wisdom says if you devote equal resources to both sides, then you will have achieved balance. The seesaw will become level. But as I set out to show in this book, Jerusalem has many, many more sides than two, and also many, many more quarters than 9 that is on the cover, and also that is the 4 quarters that are shown on all the maps of the city. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. It seemed to me to be terribly misleading to reduce Jerusalem to 2 sides. And this idea of 2 sides and ideas of 2 sides being irreconcilable are a fiction. And any balance that may or may not result from treating such 2 sides equally will never be an equitable balance. Israel has overwhelmingly the larger proportion of power, money, resources, assets, status, visibility. The seesaw, that seesaw is not level to begin with. So to achieve an equitable balance, one must act unequally. And if you think about the fulcrum, there's a very famous quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who died quite recently. He said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." So in this book, I haven't taken an equal number of stories about Jewish people and Jewish culture in Jerusalem as against everybody who isn't Jewish. This book favors those who begin with fewer advantages. I'm choosing to amplify the voices of the unlistened to, if you like. So in this talk, I just want to introduce myself a little bit first, and why I wrote the book. I want to tell the story of where those 4 quarters of Jerusalem came from and why it matters. And then I'll just add in a couple of stories at the end before we then move to a Q&A, and I'm very happy to answer questions. So there's a map of the old city. I'm very lucky to have been able to have visited Jerusalem really all my life since I was a child, which was 40 odd years ago. My first visit was at the age of 11 in 1980. And then in 1982, just very soon after that, my father arranged for me to have my bar mitzvah twice, once in the synagogue that we used to go to at home, and then again at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And I've been coming back to Jerusalem all my life. It's not quite every single year ever since, but I've lived in different parts of the city, including inside the old city. I've traveled and I've worked and I've visited. So this is the old city. This is the walled area at the middle of the city. And these are the three major holy sites. In yellow, I've marked Al-Aqsa. The Western Wall is in red, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the site of the crucifixion burial of Jesus, is in blue. And just in case people are not familiar, this is not a large place at all. The area inside the walls is less than 1 square kilometer. It's home to only about 35,000 people, 90% of whom inside the walls are Palestinian. So one motivation for me for writing this book was, over all of those visits, all of those travels, and all those times that I was living and working there, it was very clear to me, looking at how outsiders, how visitors, tourists or pilgrims would interact, that people came with a very clear sense of where they wanted to go and what they wanted to do. People would come as pilgrims or whatever to the church. They wanted to pray at the mosque. They wanted to touch the wall and pray there. And there was a strong sense that the people who they were meeting on the way to tick their box were kind of in the way. They were an impediment to the goal of reaching the holy place. I saw that a lot. You see it an awful lot. That's not exclusive to Jerusalem at all. But trying to counter that, to combat that, and to show a better way was a strong motivation for me to try and humanize the people of the old city. Another motivation was really seeing how the reality of the old city didn't match up to all the maps that people like me, outsiders and tourists and pilgrims, were using. What you see, these are two maps which I've taken from the internet, from news organizations. What you see is a sharp, clear division within the walls of the old city into these 4 quarters. The top left is the Christian quarter, the top right is the Muslim quarter, the bottom left is the Armenian quarter, and bottom center, bottom right is the Jewish quarter. As anyone will know who's been there, there are no dividing lines between the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter. It's just a street, and you can walk across the street. People are the same on both sides of the street. The street is a couple of meters wide, only it's a little alleyway. But these quarters don't make sense. You know, there are churches in the Muslim quarter. There are mosques in the Jewish quarter, and there are people living everywhere. But it struck me. I mean, first of all, it hit me as a person arriving in, fresh to Jerusalem when I was young, but also looking at people who are approaching Jerusalem now for the first time. You might easily imagine that these quarters are sort of holy. This is a holy city, and it's been divided into holy quarters. That's a mistake. But from that mistake, it's a very short step to the next mistake, thinking that perhaps Christians aren't even allowed into the Muslim quarter, or that Jews may not enter the Armenian quarter or something. And if you're visiting as a Christian, maybe that Christian visitor looks at the map, sees Muslim quarter, and thinks that, it's somehow enemy territory, somebody else lives there, I shouldn't go. This is all entirely wrong. It's crazy. It's bananas. These sorts of maps that struck me as being very Western. It's a very Western conception. These maps look to me like a sort of a school atlas, a political map of Europe or something, with all these nation states locking together very nicely, with no fuzzy spaces in between. Another thing it reminds me of is there's a point in the United States where Utah and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico, these 4 states, all meet at a 4-corner point. And the more I thought about that seemed very instructive to me, because what's invisible in that formulation are the Native American indigenous lands of the Navajo Nation and the Hopi Nation and others, which were erased by those state borders in the United States. And in a similar way, in this Jerusalem context, these four quarters and how they've been divided here leave, there's no room for fuzziness. The organic messiness of urban life is completely erased. Where did this idea come from? And I started to do some research and try to find out where it came from. This is a bit of history. I'll spare you the whole weight of history, but this is a very quick 30-second romp through the cartography of Jerusalem in the Middle Ages. Maps at that point were an idealized representation of place, and they were often drawn after travel. At this period, people would travel by word of mouth. People would travel with guides. Maps were used as a way to depict how an individual, or often how a community, once back at home after the travel, conceived of the place that they'd just been to. And so you can see in this, there's a Crusader map, which dates to the 12th century there. Jerusalem is often depicted in these maps as circular, which is a reference back to the Bible from the Greek word omphalos, meaning navel. Jerusalem was seen as the navel of the world. But equally, all through this era, there are Arabic sources which speak of Jerusalem as a mixed cluster of neighborhoods. One historian speaks of 39 quarters in Jerusalem in the 13th and 14th centuries. Another one describes 18 quarters. This is Mujir ad-Din, who's a Jerusalemite historian, in 1495. This situation lasted all the way through to Napoleon. And in 1798, Napoleon invades Egypt first, and then also Palestine. And with his military forces, he brought artists, scholars, and scientists, botanists, and explorers. And the material that they brought back rather resulted in this surge of interest in Arab and Turkish culture in Europe. This map, which I put up, is now, that's the first map of Jerusalem based on measurements taken in the field, a non-figurative, non-idealized actual map as we would recognize it today. That appeared in 1818, just after Napoleon. He was a cartographer called Franz Sieber. And if I just take the centerpiece, just move in a little bit, there's loads of interest. This is a really fascinating map. East is at the top, in case you're wondering what's going on with the orientation. And you can see lots of areas, open areas inside the walls. But what we're interested in here is this, which I've highlighted, is the only label referring to ethno-religious settlement in Jerusalem. This is Judenstadt, which is the Jewish city, Jewish quarter. After Sieber, the next major advance was 1835. This is the English explorer Frederick Catherwood. And again, if we zoom in, there's tons of detail, and it's another fascinating map to explore. Looking at the quarters, the only quarter label again is the same thing as the Jewish quarter. And it's hard to see, but if you can see where I've highlighted, those are labels there for the Armenian Convent and the Greek Convent and the Latin Convent. These are areas of settlement around those churches. But their presence here reflects European concerns. Europeans were starting to look at who actually lived in Jerusalem and what they were doing and why they lived there and where did they live, and began to start identifying them on the maps. Then shortly afterwards, a couple of years later, this is 1837. This is a map by Hermann Engel from Vienna. Engel translated Catherwood into German effectively. But what he did at this point is we start to see quarters being identified. So there's a Jewish quarter again, but now we have a Turkish quarter and a Greek quarter and an Armenian quarter and a Latin quarter. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time that these names appear on a map. Now, this period, the 1830s, this was a period of political upheaval, not just in Jerusalem, but in all of Palestine as well. There was a rebellion led by Muhammad Ali in Egypt, which challenged Ottoman rule. There was a popular uprising in Palestine, which led to a power vacuum. The European powers were jockeying for position, trying to restore order, but also to take advantage of the instability to advance their own interests. And this is a period when consulates, foreign European consulates, were opening in Jerusalem for the first time, including the British consulate. And then in 1840, as all of this was going on, Britain intervened and essentially bombed Palestine into submission, and then handed it back to the Ottoman sultans in Constantinople. But after they'd done so, British naval forces, military forces remained. And as part of that, there was a group of Royal Engineers who stayed, and they were surveying terrain to produce maps for the military. And in 1841, two Royal Engineers, Lieutenants Edward Aldrich and Julian Simons, surveyed Jerusalem, and they produced what was the most accurate street plan up to that point, which was published in, I've just put this up, this is published in plain form in 1845. But this conflict around 1840 was not just about geopolitics. British evangelical Protestant missionaries had long had their eye on the unevangelized people of the Ottoman Empire. They were unable to convert Muslims to Christianity because Ottoman law, which prevailed at that time, stipulated a death as the punishment for people who converted away from Islam. They hated Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity as well, but they had a lot of difficulty converting Catholics and Orthodox as well, partly because there was little willingness within those communities to convert, and partly because it could easily spark a diplomatic row. France protected Catholic rights, Russia protected Orthodox rights. And there had long been, and in fact there still is, a strain in Protestant evangelical thinking that sees the conversion of the Jews as a necessary prelude to the second coming of Christ. So what we find is that all British efforts in Jerusalem at this time went into converting Jews. So at this time, Britain, while all this instability was happening and while the consulate was opening on diplomatic fronts, Britain also appointed the first Protestant bishop of Jerusalem, a man called Michael Alexander, who, appropriately enough, was formerly a rabbi who had converted away from Judaism to Christianity. He arrived in early 1842, and with him was a young chaplain whose name was George Williams, and he was aged only about 27 at this time, and he fancied himself a scholar. So this is the front page of a book that he wrote. He was only in Jerusalem for just over a year, about 14 months, and then he was posted elsewhere to Russia and to Dublin and other places. And in 1849, he published a new edition of this book, The Holy City, and it included a map. And that is the map that it included. This map was drawn from the Royal Engineers Survey of 1841, but it had additions. And there's a line, it's quite hard to see, I've actually blown up the line. There's a line right at the bottom of the map, which is in italics. The next slide, I'm just going to put up the next slide, which shows that slightly more clearly. I'll read it. The plan, this is a plan of the town and environs of Jerusalem, copied by permission of Field Marshal, the Marquis of Anglesey, from the original drawing of the survey made in March 1841. The writing added by Reverend G. Williams, Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and Reverend Robert Willis, Professor of that university. So, Robert Willis never went to Jerusalem. He was a professor of mechanical engineering. So let's not worry too much about him. But we can worry about George Williams, because what we have now on the map that he was publishing are the Christian quarter, which I'm highlighting. And now I'm highlighting the Armenian quarter, and now I'm highlighting the Jewish quarter, and now I'm highlighting what he called the Mohammedan quarter, the Muslim quarter. As far as I can tell, George Williams was the instigator of the four quarters of Jerusalem. And I think I've not come across anybody who's written about this before. I'm very happy to be proved wrong if it has been written about before, but I think I'm the first person to identify Williams himself. Maps before him didn't show these quarters. And just about every single map ever made since has shown these quarters. Now, there's a direct line, obviously, from George Williams in 1849 through to the maps of Jerusalem that we will use and see, that are reinforced in the media, in literature, in academia, in guidebooks, on tourist maps, in every conceivable medium. Why have the four quarters survived? They've survived because they suit the colonial ambitions of successive waves of rulers of Jerusalem, right down to our own time. The quarters, these four quarters, are false. And they were invented, as we've seen, by this 19th century old Etonian missionary. They always were false, but it suited Jerusalem's colonizers to divide the city's populations against each other. It suited those ambitions to foster, in effect, sectarian division. Now, Williams himself was even aware that he was deliberately marginalizing the lived experience of Jerusalem's own people. You remember those 39 quarters from the 13th century and the 18 quarters of Mujahid ad-Din from 1495. And even today, in Jerusalem, all of those communities, all those different ethnicities and religions and social identifications, all those people that live and work inside the old city. For Williams, and for essentially all of Jerusalem's map makers ever since, they are, as you can see on the screen, this quote that he writes in his book, they are all numerous but unimportant. Now, there's a whole other discussion also to be had about how we use the word quarter in English, its military origins, its nuances of power and class and status, which are nowadays all tied up in, as you can see from the picture, these sorts of municipal gentrification schemes which are trying to make us buy into social division, and specifically how all of that has colored how we think of Jerusalem when we only ever see it divided into four quarters. That's a whole other discussion. I would love to get into that. I touch on it in the book, and perhaps we can save it for another time. I wanted to return to the map to take in some of Jerusalem's many, many marginalized communities of today. So for this book, I was very lucky to have spent some time talking to and also writing about the people at the Indian Hospice, which I've highlighted on the map up in the north. Jerusalem has many of these hospices. The hospice in this context is a Muslim religious institution, and specifically related to Sufism, to Islamic mysticism. And this is a really fascinating place. It commemorates a legendary visit to Jerusalem 800 years ago by Baba Farid Shakarganj, who is one of India's most celebrated mystics. And he's supposed to have meditated here for 40 days, and there is still a cave and a small mosque there, which is now home within this compound to a little cluster of Indian Palestinian families, or rather one extended family. Just nearby is, which I've highlighted on this map, is the Afghani Hospice and the Bukharia Hospice, built back to back against each other. It's a little community with this centuries-long tradition of hosting Muslims from Bukhara and from the neighboring lands of Central Asia. So Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmen, Afghans, Uyghurs, and many others as well. These stories abound all over Jerusalem. There are many, many, many more. There's a neighborhood that is home to Jerusalem's Dom families who self-identify as gypsies and who have lived inside the walls for 200 years or more. There's a center of African settlement right at the gates of Al-Aqsa, this community of about 400, 450 Muslim people with origins in West and Central Africa. There are many neighborhoods centered on churches, Armenian, of course, but there's also Coptic and Syriac and Maronite, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Greek Catholic, Armenian Catholic, many, many others. I spent some time actually at the Karaite synagogue as well. There's a fascinating story there of Karaite Jews who, as a community, are rejected as not being Jewish by the Israeli state and by mainstream Judaism as well. Mainstream Judaism draws two sources of authority: the written Torah, which we know as the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the oral Torah, which is a collection of commentaries and interpretations which were gathered together and written down about 1500 years ago as the Talmud. Mainstream Judaism accepts both. Karaite Judaism rejects the authority of the Talmud and the rabbis and concentrates solely on the authority of the Old Testament. So they have many, many doctrinal differences between themselves and mainstream Judaism. They take their shoes off before they enter the synagogue. They will kneel on the carpet to pray. They will touch their head to the floor to pray. There are many others as well. Their synagogue in the old city is probably the oldest synagogue still functioning. It's now underground. You have to go down 20 something steps down to reach it. I was not allowed in because I'm not Karaite. There's a fascinating story there as well. There are many stories. I'm looking at the time. I just want to end with a story about a place that many people may know if you've been to Jerusalem. This is Jaffa Gate, which I've highlighted on this map, which is the main entrance to the old city from the west. Now, if you stand outside Jaffa Gate with your back to the walls, there's a road which passes in front of you, left to right. And this road tells its own story. That's a satellite map of Jerusalem with the old city marked and Jaffa Gate as well. And with your back standing outside Jaffa Gate, to the right, that road bends around to the northwest and it eventually goes out and it reaches Jaffa, the port city of Jaffa on the coast. And the same road to the left bends southwards down to Bethlehem and to Hebron and on down into the desert. Now, in European languages, in English, and also French and German, Spanish, Italian, many, many others, and also Hebrew as well, you turn right. This gate is Jaffa Gate. It links to Jaffa because that's how Europeans understood this place, as connecting Jerusalem to the coast and also from Jaffa to the wider world of the Mediterranean and the West and Europe beyond. In Arabic, you turn left on that road. This, the same place, has always been and still is. It has a few names, but its major name is Bab al-Khalil. Khalil is Hebron, it's the city of Hebron. So this same place is instead seen as a connection point between Jerusalem and these more meaningful communities which are closer at hand. Bethlehem is a holy city. Hebron is a holy city. And this place then links Jerusalem and these other two all together. That happens a lot in Jerusalem, where the same place will have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different names in different languages, each of which tells a different story. Now, just inside Jaffa Gate is this little courtyard tucked in between buildings. So on the side, one side is the Israeli tourist office, on the other, I think, is a ticket office or money changer, something. In the courtyard are 2 graves, and one of them has, as you can see on this picture, a rather fancy marble turban attached to it. Now the story goes, there's a close-up picture of them, and this is what you'll hear from tour guides, what you'll read in books. Shopkeepers will tell you, just about anybody will tell you these stories, that these are the graves of the 2 architects who worked for Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, designing and building the walls of Jerusalem in 1537. And the legend goes that Suleiman, who never went to Jerusalem, was so furious to discover that his new walls had excluded the holy sites on Mount Zion, which rises just to the south of Jerusalem, that he had his architects beheaded and buried here as a warning. Or, and you'll often hear these two stories told side by side, Suleiman was so delighted with his wonderful new walls that he beheaded his architect on the spot to stop anybody else commissioning them to produce even finer work later in their careers. Either way, you're supposed to tut the bloodthirstiness of this, how cheap life was, how cruel the Sultan was. This is all, not only is it nonsense, but it's Islamophobic nonsense. Suleiman's walls, as you can see from this map, followed the line of previous walls. Mount Zion had never been walled. You can see a picture of it. There's no reason to wall it now. Running a wall around a massive mountain makes no sense at all. And anyway, if you think about it, if that was a burial of disgrace, why would you then decorate the grave with a marble turban? And equally, if it was a burial of gratitude, why would you bury these two architects by the side of a public road instead of in sanctified ground inside a cemetery? None of it makes any sense whatsoever. And then I was lucky to meet this chap, whose picture I've just put up. This chap is Fawaz Atiye, a judge who works on the Ramallah Appeals Court. His family has been associated with the area inside Jaffa Gate and has held out land there as well for more than 500 years. And that dossier, which he's holding under his arm there, holds the truth about these two graves. I'm not going to bore you with the entire story. He explained it all to me, top to bottom. Broadly, it runs like this. 1590, which is a solid 50 years after Suleiman's walls had been built, Judge Atiya's ancestor, who was a man named Ibrahim al-Safuti, endowed property exactly here for his sons and daughters, and the property is identified. There are houses, there's a bakery, so on. So in 1590, there were no graves. And then I discovered separately that a Jerusalemite historian called Yusuf Natche had already published evidence in 2005 from his own research in the Jerusalem archives that the two graves that are there now existed there in the year 1656 under the name of al-Safadiyya. They were called al-Safadiyya, which means that they were related in some way to the town of Safa, which is in northern Palestine. So sometime between 1590 and 1656, which is long after Suleiman's walls, two scholars or nobles or mystics from Safad were in Jerusalem, and they died, perhaps at the same time or perhaps not. And a small portion of land was taken from the al-Safuti endowment to bury them in this place where they lived and worked and maybe studied, just inside Jaffa Gate. And there they lie still to this day. So we can forget all about these supposedly beheaded architects, and we can instead reclaim this tiny little link between the mystical city of Jerusalem and the mystical city of Safa. Or we could, if the situation in Jerusalem, and specifically the situation at Jaffa Gate, wasn't quite as tormented and unstable and horrible as it is. So I've talked an awful lot. I just want to finish with one point, if that's okay. The Palestinians of Jerusalem are under intense pressure. I don't have to explain to a Caabu audience or to an MBI Foundation audience about the significance of what Israel is doing in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, in Iwan, Khan al-Ahmar, the Mount Scopus National Park, the cable car, the status quo at Al-Aqsa, Isawiya, all of that. This is an intensely political confrontation, enacting a policy of oppression and aggression. Now, it's been very instructive to me in this horrible war in the last couple of weeks in Ukraine, how little equivocation there has been in the West. It's very plain who is the aggressor and who has the right of resistance and defense, and also how cultural and sporting boycotts and boycotts of consumer products can form an effective way to isolate an aggressor. That message has been lost in relation to Israel and Palestine. There's a new generation, people in their 20s and 30s, for whom the struggles of the past, struggles based on land and religion and nationalism, have failed, and who see the urgency instead of struggling for human rights. And they look, and many other people as well, look around the world, look at Israel and Saudi Arabia and Iran and India, and they look at the American right wing, and they reject the idea of ethno-religious identification as a basis for state building. But the generation above them, which is my generation, I'm 53, people in their 40s and their 50s and their 60s, will continue to hold power for many years or even decades to come. If I was to write about the grievous abuses of power happening nightly in Isawiya on the edge of Jerusalem, it might register with a small core of engaged observers, but it would otherwise pass 99.9% of people by. So, as well as for the people of Jerusalem, I wanted to use my platform to write this book for my own generation of onlookers, to try and tell them that the stories that they grew up with about Jerusalem, about this ethno-religious quartering into four quarters, this sectarian division, about how this is supposedly a conflict of equals, about how it's an age-old hatred between religions that can never be solved, how they're both as bad as each other, how all of that is wrong. My generation needs to change its ideas in order that the next generation will be better able to effect real change. So these stories of mystics and tombs and all of that, all the different communities of Jerusalem, they're fun. I love them. And I've had a whale of a time researching them and writing, particularly because they humanize the people of the old city. But as the Guardian, Guardian correspondent Ian Black correctly and very astutely noticed in his review of my book for The Observer a few days ago, my purpose in writing these stories was to weaponize them. There's a job to do. And if this book, instead of passing 99% of people by, if it can maybe pass 98% of people by instead, or maybe 95% even, then I'm counting it as a success. Thank you very, very much for listening for so long. I'm very, very happy to move to a Q&A. Chris, if you want to come in.
Thank you very much, Matthew. If people could put any questions in the chat, that would be great. But I'm going to kick off with one and abuse my privilege here as chair, because one of the things that fascinated me, because you mentioned already the way in which George Williams was almost certainly, your research shows, the one who determined the four quarters that people know today. But also the other thing was to go to the time of Ronald Storrs and Charles Ashby, and the way in which they tried to sort of, which is something I sort of feel when going into the old city, the way in which it's so separated from the rest of the city, and the way in which they tried to sort of make it almost, I suppose, like a museum. I mean, how did that work? How did they, as town planners, as civic officials, affect the look and the makeup of the city?
It's a really, really interesting question, and also it's worthy of, you know, like another hour of talking. It was very, very strong, that British influence, from the naming of the old city, which came about at that time as well, through to how we see and experience the old city today. Looking at the walls of the old city, how they've been separated from the communities all around with these, there are lawns which have been put in place where there used to be previously, before the 1920s, and in different areas before the 1940s, lines of shops. There was commerce, there was life, there was activity lined up against the walls, the external line of the walls of the old city, from Jaffa Gate northwards, around Damascus Gate, around Zion Gate in the south. And all of that was cleared away. It was cleared away at different times, also by different people. It was also cleared away in the 40s and afterwards, in the 60s, by Israel as well. But that, if you like, that slicing and dicing of creating a sacred reserve around the walls of the old city was it was a catastrophe for the people who live and work there. It took the meaning of the place away from them. So they you know, the roots of people who live there go back centuries. They are tied into the city and to the history of the city and to the fabric of the city. And you have British colonial supervisors coming in, and very, very quickly, in the space of months, deciding that the holy places are far too important to have ordinary people living there. And so we must resolve this situation by creating a reserve, by limiting new building. There's this law, which I touch on in the book as well, which is still in force today, British created and British sponsored law, that says all the buildings of Jerusalem must be faced in this particular kind of local Jerusalem limestone. Lots of people love it. It drives me crackers. I hate it, and I say so in the book. This is a look that was achieved by King Herod 2,000 years ago, using the local stone in these rectangular blocks, very regular, everywhere, to create a city that looked exactly the same wherever you look. And now we have Britons coming in from outside saying, everything has got to look the way it looked 2,000 years ago. You cannot build anew, you cannot innovate, you cannot do anything that might tamper with the supposedly sacred nature of this place. It's horrible.
I'm going to take
You're muted. Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm going to take, with your permission, a number of questions together. John McHugo, you've got a question, John?
Yes. Thank you for a very, very interesting talk, Matthew. My question is, the so-called four quarters of Jerusalem, three are named after religions, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. One can see a logic there, but the fourth is an Armenian quarter. And the Armenians, of course, are a people as opposed to a religion. Now, they're one of the Christian peoples of the Middle East, but there are many other Christian peoples as well. It seems to me like an anomaly. Can you shed any light on why they chose to have an Armenian quarter?
Okay, and we've got a question from Mr. Bowen. Is that Jeremy Bowen? I don't know about the Karaites. Are you still with us? Essentially, would like to know, do you have any stories about the connections between Jerusalem and the Karaites in Crimea? And we also have a question from Alistair Hurst. It's a good question. Alistair, are you with us? Okay, well, his question is essentially wants to know, because he's got an old map, the Cartier des Maghrébins. And what exactly was that? I know you've written about, so it's all in the book. So
Okay.
we'll have those three questions for you.
Wow. Okay. Each of those also is another lecture. I'm going to start at the end and work backwards. The Moroccan quarter, the Quartier des Maghrébins, very, very quickly, because it's a long and a horribly complicated and very, very painful story. This was an area of Jerusalem in the south, very close to what's now the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, which was established soon after Salah ad-Din recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in the 12th century. And Salah ad-Din's son established a property endowment there for the Moroccan and North African, generally Moroccan. It's slightly confusing because of translation between Arabic and English. More accurate probably is North African rather than Moroccan, but Moroccan is easier in English. For the fighters from there who helped liberate Jerusalem. There were homes, there were mosques, there were institutions, whatever, that lasted all the way through. But obviously, because of the position of this place, directly against virtually the Western Wall. So in between areas of Jewish settlement where there were synagogues and yeshivas, in between there and the wall itself was this quarter of Muslim North African settlement. All during the early 20th century, there were attempts to try and buy this area in order to facilitate access to the Western Wall. None of them succeeded for various different reasons. To cut a horribly long and very complicated story short, we got to the point of 1967 when Israel occupied the old city. They occupied on the 7th of June. On the 8th of June, David Ben-Gurion, the former Prime Minister of Israel, visited the area along with the Israeli mayor and the various other officials. And he said, we need to knock this whole thing down. He also said we need to knock down the walls of Jerusalem as well. Fortunately, that didn't happen. That was the 8th of June. 9th of June, they drew up a plan. The army said, the Israeli army said, do it and don't ask me why. The Israeli government, the Minister of Defense said, just do it quickly and don't ask any questions. And on the 10th of June, men went in with sledgehammers first. There were Israeli soldiers went through shouting at everybody to leave. People rushed away as quickly as they could. Men went in with sledgehammers after dark. And then bulldozers worked through the night. And by the 11th of June, the place was flattened. So there was something like 130 buildings were destroyed. There were many, many families. I think I've heard even a total of 600 families. That sounds like a lot. Maybe it was 600 individuals, I don't know, who were dispossessed. And there were people who died. There's a story of a woman who was deaf. She didn't hear all the banging and the shouting to leave, and she stayed in her home and she was bulldozed. And even I discovered 32 years later, there's an interview with an Israeli army engineer who oversaw that project. And he quite explicitly said that that night we found several more what he called Arab corpses. Some were disposed of, some were taken away, and some were not. And he says, we just carried on. And they were bulldozed into the dirt, which is now forming the plaza, that huge plaza in front of the Western Wall, which was perhaps the most shocking and horrifying detail when I was doing my research. This is a horrible detail. That was the quarter of the Moroccans, which lasted from give or take 1200 through to 1967. Those families are now dispossessed. There's one or two properties on the edge of the quarter still survived. There's a Sufi lodge, as was, which is now barely used, in a small mosque, and a little courtyard with 6 families who are supported by the Waqf of Morocco, who still live there, just right, exactly opposite an Israeli security point, leading down steps which go to the Western Wall Plaza. There's one or two properties have survived. One was taken over as a police post. The families of the dispossessed still meet every so often. There's a little community gathering. People get together. Those stories are very, very rarely told in English in the West. I've told it in my book. I hope it gets wider coverage. That's a long answer. The Karaites in Crimea. Yes, there are Karaite Jewish communities in Egypt and also in Crimea as well. There were these were two sources of the community, but now very widely dispersed. I don't know what the situation is for any Karaite Jews in particular who may or may not be left in Crimea or in other places nearby in Ukraine. I don't know what's going on at the moment. I'd be very interested to find out. There are expat Karaite communities in America, San Francisco and Los Angeles in particular. John's question, thank you, John, for asking about the Armenians. Yes, you're right. The Armenians, they don't fit into this paradigm of Muslim, Jewish, Christian. Well, they do because they're Christian, but they were granted or somehow gained this idea of a separate quarter. Why? I don't have an answer for you why. I think it probably rests on location. Christians, when they settled in Jerusalem, tended to settle, in and around nearby the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So there you find different communities, Greeks and Latins and other communities, Copt, who live in different places around in that area. The Armenians had established themselves. This is very, very early. This is the 4th century. They are one of the first nations to have accepted Christianity. And they were in Palestine. Some historians put them in Palestine even before Christ. But there were relations between Armenia and Palestine going a long, long, long way back. And they were established in the place where they are now, that Cathedral Church of St. James, which is still visitable today, was built on the site of a church which originated in 300 and something in the early 4th century. So it may simply have been an issue of location, that the Christians, most of the Christians were there, except for these Armenians who happened to be there. The Armenians, it's a very interesting consequence of that is that nowadays the Armenians, the Armenian quarter comprises something like 1/6 of the area of the old city. It's nowhere near an actual quarter. None of the quarters are an actual quarter. But the Armenian quarter is particularly small, and its share of population is also tiny. It's a few hundred people. But the Armenians are benefiting from this British imposition of 4 quarters, because they, instead of being one among 20 communities or 39 communities, depending on how you define these quarters, they've become one amongst 4. And instead of being 1/6 of the area inside the walls of the old city, they are now as if they are 1/4 of the area inside the walls of the old city. So there are always trade-offs, there are always winners and losers. The case of the Armenians is very, very interesting. It's a really good question, and there's a lot of detail to explore there.
Do you have time for a couple more quick questions that we got?
Sorry, I talked too much.
Summarize those. One is about, do you bring in the issue of French Orientalists like Chateaubriand and their attitudes to Jerusalem? And another question that somebody has emailed me is about the Jordanian treatment of the old city during their period of occupation, 48 to 67, and as to whether the way in which they treated that Western Wall area, was it more because of anger perhaps at Israel's existence, or was it more for prejudice against Jewish national claims? What was the reason for that?
That's that's another very, very long answer, which I'll try and make as brief as possible. I can deal very quickly with the French question. No, I don't. I don't deal in any detail with the other European nations and their influence and presence in the Holy Land. Other people have done that, and they can do that better than I can as well. I wanted to focus on the people and tell the stories as much as I could. The issue of the Jordanians, I know, is a very, very raw one. I do touch more than touch. I give many pages, several pages, to looking at the Jordanian destruction and the expulsion of the Jews of the Jewish Quarter in 1948, and what they did subsequently. The issue about what the Jordanians did at the Western Wall is also true. The motivations I couldn't comment. I don't know. There are specialists who look at the Jordanian period. Kimberly Katz is somebody who comes to mind, who's written widely on Jordanian government attitudes towards Jerusalem in that 48-67 period. There is a question about what Israel found in 67. There's a story which is very widely repeated, that when Ben Gurion and the army cohorts arrived at the Western Wall, having occupied in 1967, that they found a public toilet built against the Western Wall. I have not been able to find evidence of this toilet. I found a lot of historians who cross-reference each other. I haven't been able to come back to a primary source to find somebody who, I don't know, took a picture or identified which building it was. You can see pictures there. Which building was the toilet? I can't see one. I don't know. I think there needs to be more research done on whether there was a toilet there or whether there was not a toilet. There was no reason why there should be a toilet there. This is a Muslim holy site. This is an Islamic holy place. There would be no toilets attached to a Muslim holy place like this. Somebody needs to do more work, and I'm not a professional academic historian. Sometimes I wish I was, but I'm not. And
we've got one final one, which I'm going to give you from Mohammed Al-Dakhshan, and he's asking really about the assimilation of the smaller communities like the Damari and the North Africans, and how successfully or not that they were assimilated, absorbed into the majority of the population. Are there any remaining traces of them on the ground?
That's a really interesting question as well. Yes, there's a lot to be said. The Dom people in particular, they have held on to their cultural heritage, at least to some degree. These are extremely marginalized and very deprived communities who are at the bottom of every economic and social and political marker, and all of them, they're at the bottom. But there is work being done from within that community to preserve the language, which has almost entirely died out, but not quite, and to maintain a strong identity. But particularly in the case of the Dom, they're fighting against really deep-seated racism. There's a quote which was said to me in a slightly euphemistic way, which was said to a friend of mine, who I'm going to repeat now, in a more dramatic way, from a lady called Amun Slim, who is Domari herself. She works in a community society within the community, and she said about her people. She actually said the Jews, being in my interpretation a shorthand for Israelis, treat us like Arabs, and the Arabs treat us like dogs, which is a very powerful thing to say. These people don't identify as Israeli and they don't identify as Palestinian. They are Dom, and they occupy a space in between the two. And for all of those reasons, there's many more reasons as well. It's very difficult for them to maintain their own cultural heritage, but they are to some degree managing to do that. And there are other communities. I referred to them briefly in the talk. There's a community of West and Central African Muslim families who have also experienced racism because of the color of their skin. But they have, in at least in some instances, overcome that racism, as historians from within that community are now starting to write and to speak and to identify. By political action, they have associated themselves very closely with the Palestinian national movement. So several of the community elders have served time in Israeli jails, and the youth of that community, being located where they are exactly at the gates of Al-Aqsa, are often first on the scene if there are conflicts or clashes with police. They have thrown themselves wholeheartedly into Palestinian political resistance, and because of that have gained, at least to some degree, a beneficial outlook from the rest of mainstream Palestinian society. So they maintain their own identity, but they are absorbed into the wider Palestinian body politic in a way that the Dom people simply are not. There are many other examples as well, but that's a couple of cases.
Well, I'm going to hand over to say the formal thank you to my colleague from the NBI Al Jabba Foundation, Marylyn Whaymand. Marylyn.
Hi there. Thank you, Chris. On behalf of Caabu and the NBI Al Jabba Foundation, I'd like to thank you, Matthew, for a very, very interesting and informative presentation. I really, really enjoyed that, and I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure we've all learned a good deal about the culturally diverse neighbourhoods of Jerusalem and their untold stories. And I do hope that leads many of us to buying the book and reading it and achieving the aims that you've set out this evening. That's very important. It was just over 2 years ago, I believe, and we had this conversation earlier, that we first asked you to come and give a presentation for us. It was unfortunately delayed by COVID, but it was well worth the wait. So thank you very much for that. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the NBI Al Jabba Foundation, we are funded solely by Sheikh Mohammed bin Isa Al Jabba, our founder and chair, and we operate in the fields of education, cultural dialogue, and good governance to enable future generations to prosper in a better connected and peaceful world. And peace is something that I'm sure all of us are hoping to achieve across the planet at this moment in time. Thank you once again, Matthew. It was fascinating. So good to meet you at last. And thank you to Chris and to Joe and to Caabu for making this event possible, for co-hosting it. And thank you to everybody for coming along here. And I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you, Chris.